evening from Washington. Without in any way minimizing the death of President Gerald R. Ford and the often moving, even majestic funeral service held for him here in the nation's capital this morning, we begin this news hour tonight with the service to our country of 3,003 other Americans who have already died in Iraq, and the report that the current president is looking to increase the number of Americans at risk there and to try to sell that increase to the rest of us under what amounts to the brand name sacrifice. Our fifth story on the countdown, senior administration officials confirming to NBC News tonight that President Bush intends to unveil, a week from today, a new plan to send more U.S. troops to Iraq, the BBC having reported earlier that the central theme of his speech will be sacrifice. Mr. Bush looking to assure the American public that he indeed has a strategy for victory in Iraq. But NBC News Pentagon correspondent Jim Miklaszewski has learned that, according to U.S. officials, President Bush has all but decided to announce what's being called a strategy of surge and accelerate in Iraq, which would involve some 20,000 additional American troops being sent there. Administration officials admitting that the decision is being made for political reasons and not military ones. The White House, cognizant that the patience of the American people is wearing thin, if not wearing out. As for what the troops would be doing, according to the BBC, the additional forces would focus on security, not on the training of Iraqi forces. A year ago this week, the commander-in-chief advocated the exact opposite.
So in 2006, the mission is to continue to hand over more and more territory and more responsibility to Iraqi forces. And as they do so, we will need fewer U.S. troops to conduct combat operations around that country. More of our forces will be dedicated to training and supporting the Iraqi units.
None of which happened. My special comment ahead. First, as to who is being blamed for the chaos that descended upon Iraq in 2006, it seems the top U.S. commander in Baghdad, General George Casey, may be on the short list for scapegoat. Senior military officials telling the New York Times that Mr. Bush is looking to bring General Casey home from Iraq as early as next month, the general having insisted earlier this year that he did not and would not need a surge in forces in Iraq, stating it might actually be counterproductive. Time now to call in our own Richard Wolff, senior White House correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Richard, good evening. Thanks for your time.
Good evening, Keith.
Let's start with an assessment of the reporting here. The BBC is reporting on one of the key points. Troop increases, not for training, but for security in Baghdad, now confirmed from the Pentagon by our Jim Miklaszewski. Does the other part, a speech with sacrifice as its theme, also jibe with what you've heard?
Well, I don't know about you, but sacrifice doesn't sound like a winning theme to me, and it does surprise me that the BBC has gone with this report. I'm sure the president will honor the sacrifice of those who have fallen. But one thing the president understood, going back to the days when he was Texas governor, was that you have to project victory, you have to project success, whether you're trying to be president or you're trying to win a war. So the idea of sacrifice, you know, they even have academic research that shows that no matter how badly a war goes, as long as you tell people you're on a path to victory, then some people will stick with you. Maybe enough people, but some people anyway. So I'm surprised that this report about sacrifice, I mean, the president still thinks he can get just about enough of his base back with him on the war, but sacrifice doesn't sound like a convincing theme to me.
Whether it's called sacrifice or some new word that the president might invent between now and next week and add to the language, given this milestone, this horrid milestone of more than 3,000 Americans in uniform having been killed in Iraq, given the administration's fondness for viewing most of its problems in terms of public relations, is the president, in his own infamous misstatement, misunderestimating just how unpopular this plan to send more troops will be, whatever he calls it?
Well, let me tell you about public opinion and the White House's view. They do believe that the most recent slide in support for the war is basically their own supporters moving away because, in their view, Republicans have lost confidence in the president's commitment to the cause, and that, in their view, again, when his own base hears him lay out this plan, then they will all rally round. We don't know if that's wishful thinking. I guess the poll numbers will tell us in a couple of weeks. But they have been slow to react to this slide in the opinion polls really since 2004, partly because of their own election victory in 2004 and partly because they didn't see 2006 coming around the corner. So again, we'll see.
The proposal, at least what was floated to the BBC, what we're putting together between that reporting and mixed reporting, would seem to have the vice president's fingerprints all over it. Is it possible that we should be concluding now that reports of Dick Cheney's policy demise had been greatly exaggerated?
Well, as someone who's reported that, I would say no. Look, the president has come to this position on his own. Maybe he lent on Dick Cheney. Well, he did lean on Dick Cheney very heavily in the first couple of years of his first term. But, you know, he doesn't need someone to tell him at this point that his whole legacy rides on it. It's got to work or else, and that failure for him and for the country is a really unacceptable option. So it doesn't surprise me that he has taken a position that Cheney also takes, which is they need to make this one look better and do it quickly.
And one last extrapolation that you can shoot down if it's wrong, but perhaps there's no accident that the Democratic Congress is set to begin on Thursday, swearing in tomorrow. Some Democrats already saying they would not fund a troop increase, no matter what you call it. Could what we have been hearing here actually be some part of a bigger plan that involves shifting the blame? Never mind General Casey, let's pin the tail on the Democrats?
You know, I think the White House has made the calculation that Democrats are not going to pull the plug on funding for the troops, in which case their view is everything else is just commentary. So I think the real test for politics here is what the administration leaves to its potential successors. The 2008 field for the White House is more important than the Democratic Congress.
Richard Wolff of MSNBC and Newsweek, great thanks and a great new year to you.
And to you, Keith.
For more on passing the blame, let us now address the military implications of the purported and reported Bush plan. Joining us now, a Pentagon veteran from the Reagan administration, former Assistant Secretary of Defense Lawrence Korb, who is now a fellow at the Center for American Progress. As always, sir, thank you for some of your time tonight.
Nice to be with you.
If in 2006 this administration's mistake in Iraq was sacrificing security in the name of training Iraqi forces, why would sacrificing training now in the name of more security be any less disastrous?
No, it won't be any less disaster. In fact, General Casey is right. I mean, he says if you put more troops in there, this will increase the Iraqis' dependence on us, and it will prevent them from making the painful political compromises necessary to create an Iraq that people are willing to fight and die for. He's the one that's right. The president is the one that's wrong.
Could we in some way be missing some part of a cost-benefit analysis? Is there some fact that we don't know about here? Is there anything on the other side of the equation, any perceptible value in sending 20,000 more Americans into Iraq, especially if they're not designated as trainers for the Iraqis?
No value. You sent about 20,000 more troops into Iraq last fall, and what happened is your casualties went up. If you send another 20,000 troops, your casualties are going to go up. You're going to increase the Iraqis' dependence on us. And as General Casey pointed out in an interview with the New York Times, we're going to get blamed if things don't go right. You know, people talk about, well, we got to train the Iraqis more. Nonsense. The problem is motivation. We wanted 6 Iraqi battalions to go into Iraq. Only 2 showed up. It's not that they weren't trained. The fact is they weren't motivated because these political compromises weren't made.
And General Casey would seem to know something about blame. It's clear that he is against any plan to send more troops, extensively quoted to that effect. What happened to the idea that the president was taking his lead, the proverbial, I'm listening to the generals on the ground? It appears that if he listens to them and the general happens to disagree with him, it's time to replace the general.
Very definitely. I mean, look what happened to General Shinseki, who told the country and the president before the war, you could not hope to secure Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein without several 100,000 troops. The number was about 500,000. Well, they said he didn't know what he was talking about. Then when it suited them to not put in more troops, and the field commanders after a while recognized that wouldn't work, well, then he would say, well, I'm going along with the military. Now that it's not working, he's going to look for scapegoats. The first one was Rumsfeld, and the second one, unfortunately, looks like General Casey. General Casey deserves a promotion. He should be made the Army Chief of Staff when General Schoonmaker steps down in a couple of months.
Well, of course, governments have been doing this to pessimistic but realistic generals since William Tecumseh Sherman, when he said the Civil War wasn't going to be over in 8 months. But a political aspect to this. The Republican Senator Chuck Hagel, who's also opposed to sending any more troops into Iraq, described the surge option before we knew about this sort of extended surge as Alice in Wonderland. Is there any sense that Republicans on the Hill, others, many, might try to steer out of this skid and abandon the president on this? Is there any way that the illogic of this policy would overcome the partisanship involved?
Well, I think it's not Senator Hagel. You got Senator Norm Coleman from Minnesota, who has just been in Iraq. He said it makes no sense. You heard what Senator Gordon Smith, the Republican from Oregon, said right before Christmas, that the policy not only was wrong, he said it was absurd and may even be criminal what we're doing, allowing these young men and young women to be killed and wounded day after day with no apparent long-term strategy.
Last point, the president was quoted by the New York Times as having told the Iraq study group about his insistence on using the word victory, which has apparently been used again today. The quote attributed to him, speaking to not the Times, but to the Iraq study group. It's a word, victory, the American people understand, and if I start to change it, it will look like I'm beginning to change my policy. What sort of snapshot does that give us as to what this policy actually is?
It doesn't tell you a thing. Victory is what General Casey says when the Iraqis make the painful political compromises necessary to create an Iraqi nation.
Lawrence Korb, Senior Fellow with the Center for American Progress. As always, sir, great thanks for your time tonight.
Nice to be with you again.